time to value is something that we don't think about a lot. Oftentimes, leaders make their highest risk decision, which is hiring other leaders, with the least amount of data. These people are trained to diagnose the situation and be able to apply a framework in the organization. And it's really about going from A to B in the shortest distance possible and with the highest quality, as opposed to the trial and error that it might take a CEO who's not familiar with that specific function.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the Epic Podcast. Edric here, and thank you so much for joining us on this season, which is titled How to Build a Better Business. Now, we're going to be tackling a lot during this season, which comes from leadership all the way down to hiring and even talent management and training. Okay, so make sure you tune into every episode of this season. Quick question for you. If you're running a business or you're part of senior management and making big decisions, what if I could only give you half of that? And that's all you needed. So that being said, this is what we call fractional leadership. And to tell us a little bit more, we've got the founder of Fractional First and a serial entrepreneur with companies like Control Shift and many more. He's going to tell us much more about it. And we brought him onto the podcast so that we can talk a little bit more about this concept of fractional leadership and how that's going to help you build a better business. Please welcome Reza Behnam to the show. All right, Reza, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I want to ask you a little bit more about your history before we do this. Now, you're a serial entrepreneur. You have so many companies, and you even have an incubator under your name as well. And you're leading all of those at the same time. Tell us a little bit more about those outfits and ventures at the same time, right? How that kind of molded your idea of, I got to be everywhere at once, so therefore maybe a fractional leader is the right place to be.
So a little bit about me. I'm Iranian-American, moved to Singapore in 2004, so almost 22 years ago. At the time, I was with Yahoo. It was supposed to be for a 2-year stint. And now, 22 years later, I'm still here.
We kept you.
Yes, and I've gladly, of course, stayed and sort of taken roots here. My role at Yahoo when I first moved to Singapore was very entrepreneurial. So even though Yahoo was a large company by then, my role was very entrepreneurial in that we had to build products for 6 countries, 6 languages, 6 different regulatory regimes in Southeast Asia. And I got a taste of entrepreneurship then. And so when I left Yahoo in 2007, I did a short stint at a venture capital fund. And then I moved into entrepreneurship because by nature, I'm more of a builder and operator. And so I started a company called Ad Central, which later became Control Shift after we merged with 2 other companies. And this was during the early days of the startup ecosystem in Singapore. And eventually we built Control Shift up. We exited, and then I realized that experience of having raised funds, hired leadership, built cultures was something that was sorely needed in Southeast Asia as we had more people going into entrepreneurship. And so I became really obsessed with the idea of, how do we make leadership work better across organizations? How do we scale better? How do we do it with more presence, not just with best practices in terms of things to do or things not to do, but with more presence and with more human qualities, if you will.
Okay, it's really interesting that how this journey actually kind of led you down that path. And now you have, again, Fractional First, right? Would you be able to just give me a quick insight into that, and then after that, we'll start to poke holes into what gaps you saw that led to this?
Sure. Well, I've been on both sides of the equation. I've been a sort of a leader at a company hiring other leaders. And what I noticed there was that oftentimes leaders make their highest risk decision, which is hiring other leaders, with the least amount of data. So if you look at all the decisions they make, this is one of the most important decisions that is made, and it is done with interviews and a few interactions with the candidate often, maybe a few reference calls. And oftentimes as leaders, we get it wrong. And the person may be really good and skilled, but they may not operate well in your culture or in your environment. So that's one issue on the sort of demand side, if you will. On the supply side, I've also been in those shoes where, frankly, once I exited some of my companies, I was wondering, what does one do when you get to, mid-age, age 50 plus, and you've built companies, you've been an entrepreneur, you've been in corporate before. How does one continue to add value in the right environments? And that's when I realized that there's a lot of people entering that second arc of their career, which are almost suffering silently because there's no, first of all, we're living longer lives, healthier lives, and people don't want to retire so early. And then these people who are typically mid-40s and above have accumulated a lot of experience. But there's no outlet for them to be able to systematically provide that across a portfolio of organizations or CEOs. And the CEOs of a lot of organizations, especially in Singapore, where we have a lot of entrepreneurs and startups, could leverage a lot of the experience that these people have gained over the years. So that's when we decided to create Fractional First, which is really a way of understanding what CEOs may need from a leadership perspective and infusing that at the right time for the right cost and in the right context.
Okay, I love what you said because it's cost, context, right? And timing. So like what we talked about offline, and I know you've gotten so many questions about this, which is, hey, can you tell me more about your platform? And you're like, no, this is not a platform, right? So how does one then better understand what Fractional First is about? If it's not a platform, is it a community? Is it a community of practice, groups of leaders coming together and freelancing? Tell us a little bit more about how this works.
Great. Well, Edric, our vision includes all of the things you mentioned and more, right? Because in order to provide the right environment for the demand side, which are the organizations, and the supply side, which are the leaders with many years of experience to interact, you do need a community. You do need some tech. You do need some human judgment. And so our vision of Fractional First is how do we combine these to create an environment where we can match people on skills, not only hard skills, but also soft skills. And we see the fractional method or format not just as a cost-saving layer, but almost as a validation layer. So how can we bring a fractional leader inside an organization, first by understanding the context of the organization, what they're missing, where their strengths and weaknesses are, both in terms of hard skills, but also soft skills, bring them in and have them interact and work together. And for the company and organization to see how this person makes decisions under pressure, in uncertainty, in the context that they have. And then over time, maybe build a deeper relationship. So the reason we don't call it a platform is there's lots of other tools out there, platforms out there that are just relying on technology to do all of this. And our vision is to build the technology as the backbone, but have the human layer involved for the judgment, for the discernment, for interpreting signals that you might get from the platform in a more human way, and be more involved in coaching and helping CEOs pick the right fractional leaders for their context.
Oh, I love that, because then you have the fractional leaders, right, who can be at any level, meaning, any size of company. I would say be the startup, or whether or not you're medium size or you're an enterprise level, if that's required. And what strikes me the most is the human factor, which I really love. And I want to circle back to the like what you mentioned, the biggest mistakes that senior leaders make is hiring, right? Is in the hiring process. Now, what are you doing differently that is actually that counteracts this or makes it better?
So one of the things we do is we're involved in fractional placement, full-time placement, advisor placement, board placements, but we offer the fractional piece almost as a validation layer. So even if a company wants to hire somebody full-time, we would recommend, hey, why don't you work with this person?
Try it out first.
Try it out first. Try before you buy.
30-day trial period, money back guarantee.
It's actually a de-risking the decision of hiring a full-time person. And then both the organization and the leader realizing after 30 or 60 days that it might have not been the right decision for either one of them. So it's not just about protecting the organization, it's also about protecting the interests of the leader. So we provide this as a sort of a try before you buy, as a validation layer. The other thing we do is we use the technology layer to understand signals. So we leave sort of a lot of signals in our LinkedIn profiles, in our CVs, in our speeches, in our bios about who we are as people. And we've trained our models, our agents, to help us detect some of those signals, not as a definitive sort of personality profile of someone, but as things that we use to then ask questions in our vetting process and our interview process. Okay. And our interview process is really focused on understanding who these people are as humans and as leaders, not whether they fit one role or not, but really understand where their passion lies, where their interest lies. What would they do if they weren't paid? Right? What is the interest? What do they lean into? And really understand them as people. And then when the right opportunity pops up, we actually match them to that. So it's both understanding these leaders really well using technology, but also human judgment and discernment. And on the other side, understanding the CEOs and where they are and the context they have. And then making sort of the right connections at the right time.
Well, I really love that, because one of the things that I actually speak to quite a number of business owners about is that you have to make sure that you have a little bit more digital presence. And this is exactly what you're picking up every time somebody's putting up an article on LinkedIn, a post or a repost with their own comments and their thoughts. It shows a sense of leadership. It shows a sense of opinion and knowledge, areas of expertise. And those are, like what you mentioned, those are the things that are picking up. So if you're listening, please start investing in your own digital real estate. Do your content, do your articles. These things are very, very important, okay? I've said this time and time again on the podcast. So please get it done. Then after that, you can join Fractional First as part of that talent roster, okay? Now, that being said, I really also want to ask this, because I think fractional leadership is something that it's not new in the market. There are people going around and marketing themselves as fractional, CEO, CFO, CMO, CIO, CTOs, whatever. You got it. Do you find this to be a little bit more of a Western concept, or is this something that's a little bit that can? Sorry, let me ask that again. Do you find this to be something a little bit more of a Western concept, or can it be transferred or translated directly to an Asian context, but it needs to be extremely nuanced?
Actually, no, and here's why. Right, we've been using advisors, board members, and consultants. Right, now the difference between a fractional leader and everybody I just mentioned is that typically a fractional leader will have some kind of operating responsibility, not just an advisory responsibility. So in many cases, even if they're an advisor, they report to the CEO, they have something that they're supposed to do. So maybe it's opening doors into a certain industry, or if it's a CFO at a Series A company, it's actually being a hands-on CFO with maybe one or two team members who are sort of less senior or are more hands-on, but they own the function in many cases. So we've had a variation of fractional leaders as advisors and board members already in play. And we've had the gig economy for a while now, but that has typically been for more hands-on type of delivery roles. And so the concept of fractional is taking the gig economy one level up towards more senior people and more senior leaders who can add a lot of value. And oftentimes I like to say, we know we're successful if we've matched a leader to a company and that leader has sort of de-risked the organization or the function that they're working in, has improved results, and in the process, as a byproduct, has created ROI, so saved money or increased output, all at the same time. So because oftentimes time to value is something that we don't think about a lot. But if a decision is going around for 6 months in a scale-up or a startup or a family office, and there's not enough judgment to make a decision, that's time and resources that are sort of not being used efficiently. But if you have the right person to help you make that decision, that's time to value, and therefore it's a savings. It could be a savings, even though you're paying for that fractional, and you might be paying quite a bit for that fractional, but still in the medium to long run, it's a savings.
Got you.
Yeah. So I feel the word fractional maybe was used first in more developed markets like the US, but it's now quite prevalent here, and we have the government looking at how to help senior leaders and organizations create matches and so forth. So now it's become quite prevalent here as well.
Well, considering that in Singapore specifically, our retirement age has increased, it's going to be increased, I think, next year onwards, right? So this is going to be a perfect place for them. I'm going to ask you something that a small business owner would probably ask you. If I have a small team of people, why should I take a fractional leader when this person may not be there all the time? I need them to be there, but I can't afford full time. What do you think is a good solution for how Fractional First would actually kind of approach this and help them out?
Sure. So just like anything in business, there are best practices. And so it's very important that that we follow those best practices when making this decision. So I'll give you a real life example. We've been working with a small and medium-sized business which has operations across a number of different countries. They're in the industrial space, and they needed a head of HR. And to date, they've been using somebody. They've been they had been working with somebody who was good, but perhaps not as experienced in the HR space, especially in the industrial space. And so they had to make a decision whether to go ahead and hire somebody that was more sort of at a manager level, or hire somebody a couple of levels more senior, but only join them part-time. And so they ended up hiring somebody with 20 years of experience who had industrial industry experience.
Sounds like a gem.
Brought them on, 2 days a week. And it turns out that the company had enough support in that organization, in the HR organization, to be able to support somebody who's more strategic, but also be able to execute on the day-to-day things. So you're really getting, in that case, somebody who is much more efficient at not only the strategic direction, but the day-to-day execution, because they've been around the block. They know who to call when something happens. And so in that situation, they ended up, getting someone much more experienced, and they ended up paying slightly less than what it would have cost them to hire the full-time person who was a bit less strategic.
Right. I completely understand where that comes from, because let's just say, for example, in the world of podcasting, a lot of us are producers who move around. And why do some producers actually get hired more often than other producers is because they bring a set of systems with them. As in the words of Liam Neeson, he has a very specific set of skills.
Correct.
He brings them in. And at the end of the day, like what you're saying, it does make it more efficient because, okay, this is the workflow. This is what we normally use. If you follow this system, it's going to work. And if we apply it to your company, then it should flow a little bit better. I suppose with the experience factor as well. I mean, wow, 20 years of experience, bringing that to the table. I'm pretty certain that person had a very keen eye for exactly what needed to be changed. And do you think that when we talk about time versus value, right? Do you think that that value definitely is much higher than the time spent if that business owner would have just tried to do it himself?
Absolutely. It's night and day, because these people are trained to diagnose the situation and be able to apply a framework in the organization. And it's really about going from A to B in the shortest distance possible and with the highest quality, as opposed to the trial and error that it might take a CEO who's not familiar with that specific function as much. And what sort of the unsaid thing about fractionals is that you might hire a fractional on retainer for 2 days a week, but most fractionals end up working more than the allotted amount of time and put in more effort, because at the end of the day, these are people who are passionate about what they do and want to sort of associate themselves with quality. So a lot of people think the opposite. If I hire a fractional, their skin is not in the game. Whereas what we see is actually the opposite, because a fractional wants to have your backing, your CEO's backing, for the next job they might be able to get. So they want a referral from you, and they want the CEO to be able to say, hey, this fractional really helped me execute on X, Y, Z. So they're really sort of, most of the fractionals we deal with are really passionate about what they do, and they really sort of get their teeth into the problem and help solve it.
Yeah, I get what you mean, because it's one of those things. I mean, I think you've been there where, let's just say, for example, okay, I'm only going to give you 2 days a week, let's just say. And then you realize that, my goodness, in those 2 days, I can't solve those problems. I just have to take it upon myself to get it done. And essentially, I'm working more than those 2 days. Is that the case for everybody?
In most cases, that is the case. And there's also a cost to being a fractional leader. And most people, when they're first approaching making a decision, don't realize this. But a lot of fractional leaders, especially when they start out, they end up spending 30, 40, 50% of their time on non-billable tasks. So this is writing their deck, writing their positioning, who they are, speaking to potential customers, writing proposals. And so when you have a paying client who values what you do, you want to make sure they're happy, because, as I said, this could be a validation layer towards something that is even more involved. But or alternatively, that CEO can recommend you to 2 other companies and give you a sort of a really glowing review of what you've been able to do, and therefore reduce that non-billable time that you have. And that's precisely where we operate as Fractional First. We try to remove that inefficiency for leaders so that they can get their next role easier. We facilitate that.
Cool. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit from what Fractional First can do for others.
Yeah.
I'd love to get your story on how you're building Fractional First, because starting my own company, I'm also wondering myself, how does number one, like for you, when we find leaders, we probably find them in a certain community or a niche that we know. And then, okay, let's say, for example, I know this guy in manufacturing. I know this lady from semicon. I know this lady from airline, and so on and so forth. So you've got this, let's say, first 4. When do you decide that you go, I'm only going to focus on these verticals, and then after that, then I'm going to diversify and get more? Like, what is that point where you feel you can pivot? Or, sorry, wrong, not pivot, but start to diversify?
Sure. So the approach we've taken is we see us sort of facilitating, as I mentioned, the supply side, which is the leaders who want to be involved in fractional work, and the demand side, which are CEOs who are looking for these capabilities. And the biggest obstacle for fractional leaders is that there's more supply of talent these days than there is demand. And the lack of demand isn't because there isn't a need necessarily. It's because most CEOs and companies have been thinking in a binary form for so long, like the traditional way of hiring. You either don't hire or you hire full-time. So there's a little bit of education and evangelization needed where to talk about how talent, especially senior talent, can be more liquid. And so we are involved in talking to a lot of CEOs of scale-ups, startups, family offices, and helping them sort of figure out where fractional makes sense for them, and then helping leaders sort of fill those gaps. So in many ways, we focus a lot on the demand side so that we can help our supply side.
That's very interesting because that is actually market study, isn't it? That's your right. Business intelligence. Now, walk me through this because the listeners out there are actually going to be thinking about how they can get their product or how they can get their service out there as well. Would you be able to walk us through that process where how Fractional First began to, started thinking we need to get ourselves out there? What were the first few steps that you took?
So first few steps in our case is we did a lot of market interviews, first-hand interviews, primary interviews with stakeholders. So we had a hypothesis around the difficulty in hiring leaders on behalf of the organization. So we talked to a lot of CEOs and understood their difficulties.
Well, how'd you get them all together to do that? Or did you just talk to them one by one?
One by one. So yeah, so we went through probably 30 interviews for both organizations, CEOs of organizations, and another 30 or 40 interviews for fractional talent. Because we had a hypothesis that the system was broken, and based on my own experiences being both a CEO and a fractional leader. And we sort of validated some of those hypotheses through interviews. And then we started to build in public. We really built, initial products that we would, first mock-ups, and we would run them by some of these same people that we interviewed, but then small steps in terms of the product and releasing it. So as a very simple example, one of the things we do is we have a very simple onboarding process for leaders. They go in, they literally type in their LinkedIn URL, and at that point, they have an option of uploading anything else they want, their CV, their speech, their presentation, but that's optional. And with that, we're able to take that and build a leadership profile for them that really dissects their LinkedIn profile and their CVs into the signals that we get, like their skill sets, their passions. And we give each leader multiple work personas. Because oftentimes, if you're using your CV or LinkedIn, you have everything chronologically based. And it doesn't do you justice in terms of bringing out the various roles you can play in an organization. And so we try to do that up front. And that's why we call it a leadership profile. And then that becomes a really interesting artifact for the CEO to be able to look at and say, this is exactly what I want, or this is sort of close to what I want. I need a bit more of this or that.
It's like the archetypes.
Correct.
So what do you have? I mean, I'm very curious. Do you have like the museum curator, the architect, the engineer? What do you have?
Well,
the three-legged lion. I don't know.
Yeah, countless. I'll just speak about my profile, right? So when I experimented with this, it came up with 3 different personas for me. One is the CEO operator. One is the venture builder. Right, which is different. There's overlap, but it could, a CEO operator can be in a larger organization, whereas a venture builder does well in ambiguity. And the third was the coach advisor, right, which I thought matched my profile quite well. And so now you don't have to create 3 different resumes if you're applying for 3 different kinds of roles, because those exist already in your leadership profile. And so depending on the lens that the client wants to look at you, they can look at that lens and understand how you operate.
It's very interesting. It almost sounds like you took something from, like, say, for example, the Clifton or Gallup, Clifton strengths profiles, or the Lominger competencies, and they're all there to build these characters, or archetypes.
Correct. Yeah. We call them personas because by the time you have 20, 30 years of experience, there are various ways you can help a leadership team and an organization. And oftentimes that's not brought to the surface.
Okay, that's very interesting. Do you ever get a leader that joins you and goes, I want to evolve my leadership?
So that's an interesting question. I'll answer it a different way, which is we oftentimes get leaders who've been in corporate and have been doing something for a long time. And they get to a point where they're like, okay, I don't see my corporate anymore. I don't see myself being in corporate anymore. Or maybe they were laid off. But many of them get to a point of life where they want to say, I want to be more intentional about what I do and how I spend my time. And I want to spend a bit more time with family, for example, or I want to have a little bit more flexibility. But I don't know where to start this fractional journey. And so in those situations, and I've been through that as well. It's not a fun journey if you don't have anybody to go on that journey with you, or at least some best practices to rely on, because there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of what does the market want versus what do I want? And oftentimes people over-index on what the market wants at the expense of what one wants. So my 2 cents to those people is it's really a 2-phased journey. The first phase is to do the internal investigation, the contemplation of, what would you enjoy doing? What would you enjoy spending your time on? And really honing in on what that is. Because in our careers, oftentimes we don't have the space to do that. We fall from one job to another job, sometimes by serendipity, sometimes by, through headhunting. So this is the first chance a lot of these leaders have had to step back and really contemplate what they want to do. And once they figure that out, which might take some time, might take 6 months, might take 4 months, might take a bit longer, then the rest of the journey becomes a little bit easier because they've done that contemplation and they've grounded in a strength inside of them to be able to carry them through. So I always say the first 50% is the internal journey. The second 50% is the external journey on how you then translate what you really want to do into something that the market wants and pays for and demands.
Okay, that's very interesting. And tell me a little bit. I'd love to dive into your story in that first 50% and the second 50% as well. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, so I think I started talking about it a little bit where I said, after exiting my companies, I started to offer some fractional services. And I was working at a venture building organization, actually quite close to where we are here, called Mach 49, where we helped larger organizations build ventures at startup speed. And then I realized I enjoy solving problems almost in a portfolio way where the more diverse, the better. And I enjoyed interacting with people and helping entrepreneurs. But I didn't know if that was something I could monetize, right? Because a lot of times you do these things pro bono, you try to be helpful to the ecosystem. Occasionally it's a paid board position, but most oftentimes it's pro bono. And so that's when I started thinking, how do I take this, something that I'm doing today, and enjoy it, and making it into something that's more structured, that provides value, that can be monetize so it can become more sustainable over time. And Fractional First seemed like the right sort of path, partially because I felt the executive recruitment business was sort of very traditional in its approach, still high risk, high costs if you're using a traditional sort of executive recruitment, sometimes 20, 30, 35% of annual salary to hire somebody. And then you're still taking a lot of the risk. So I felt that business model could use a bit of changing as well. And that's why our business model is actually quite different.
Okay. Now, I'm very curious about the first 50% all the time, because that is a big part of what this podcast is about. Because how I started this podcast was that it all started with, how do people get into leadership positions? And then why is it that we put them out on a pedestal? How do I bridge that gap? And then it became, I want to learn how to start a business. And I started talking to more business owners, and I started my own business. But like what you said, the inner work part is so tricky, because there's so much second guessing, there's so much self-doubt. Was that your process as well, as and when you were thinking about your corporate and you go, oh, should I go back to corporate? Is this going to work out? How did that go for you?
Yeah. This is very near and dear to my heart, because there's a lot of structured leadership programs, and they give you leadership hacks and do this, don't do this, and best practices. But I feel the most important leadership lesson is trying to ground yourself in what you want to stand for or what's important to you. And we don't learn that muscle in school or in business school, right? And so I was fortunate enough to sort of come across yoga many years ago. And first for me, yoga was a physical practice, and only a physical practice. But over time, I got deeper into it. I did breath work, and I really studied the philosophy behind yoga. And if I can sort of simplify that philosophy, it's really about the union of the duality we often face, the duality between the outside world and the inside world, the duality between material stuff and non-material stuff. And it's much easier for us to focus on the material stuff. And so in order to focus on the non-material stuff, and the non-material stuff can be your wants, your likes, your passions, what you're drawn towards, love for your child, love for the family, like all of this stuff don't get their fair share of discussion in leadership circles. And so we have to exercise that muscle, and that can be an enjoyable path if you start to practice it regularly. So whether it's meditation or whether it's doing something you like. Some people like running, some people like music, and they lose themselves in that activity. Like that, to me, is a form of coming to the self and then being inspired by it, but also learning that your mind is there to always challenge you and maybe sometimes even play tricks on you, and how to then know yourself enough to know, okay, this is my mind playing a trick on me. This is my imposter syndrome, or this is my sort of beat myself up day, right? And how not to get impacted by the negative loop that we sometimes create in our mind.
Wow. Okay, that is really amazing for me to hear, because it sounds like turning a difficult journey or a difficult time into a place for cultivating your self-awareness. That is very, very deep. And thank you so much for that. And just to wrap up, okay, so for the end of every podcast, or at the end of every podcast, we always ask our guests a quick fire round of 10 questions. So that being said, are you ready, sir?
Sure, let's give it a try.
All right. One word that you love.
Awareness.
One word that you strongly dislike.
Hate.
What sparks joy in the work that you do?
Sharing.
What's your routine like for peak performance daily?
Grounding to get to the clarity that I need.
What do you do when negativity or sadness hits you?
Take deep breaths.
If you could have a conversation with one person, dead or alive, fictional or non-fictional, who would that be?
The Dalai Lama.
What's a phrase or quote that has left the biggest impact on you?
We are not drops in an ocean, but we're oceans in a drop.
What's a harsh lesson that life has taught you?
What we may think of what is just isn't what nature thinks might be just. So justice in some ways is relative.
What happens to your business or your work after you have moved on past this life?
My hope is that that I will have impacted at least one person, if not more, in a positive way.
Last question. How do you want to be remembered? What's your legacy?
I think, as cliche as this might sound, I want to be remembered remembered as somebody who cared about connection and love, not in the romantic way of love, but in wanting the best for everybody.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much. And feel free to let people know how they can connect with you if they like to reach out to you or your company.
Sure. Feel free to reach out to me through LinkedIn or through Reza at fractionalfirst.com. Happy to have a conversation around fractional needs, both on the organizational side as well as on the fractional leadership side as well. Thank you.
Okay, so that was Reza on the Epic podcast. So once again, get in touch with him via email, LinkedIn, and also check out the company Fractional First. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Epic podcast. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for having me.